Im hacharish tacharishi bo'es hazos. If you, Esther, decide to be silent and you fail to play a role to save the Jewish people, says Mordechai, Revach v'atzola yamad leYehudi mimokam acher. The salvation of Klal Yisrael will come from somewhere else. Mordechai speaks in a very supremely confident manner. He doesn't say to Esther what I would have said. I would have said, you are uniquely positioned to save the Jewish people from this royal decree of genocide, lahashmid la'arga la'abed. They were at that day, the 13th of Nisan, when the decree had been signed, sealed, and sent out to the whole empire. And the question was, how are we going to escape this terrible decree? And Mordechai should have come. If it was me, I would have said to Esther, without you, we're lost. You are uniquely positioned to beg Achashverosh. You must do it. Instead of which, Mordechai says to her, if you're silent, don't worry, Klal Yisrael will be saved some other way. But you will have failed to do your life's meaning and your life's purpose. You will be lost. My question is, how was Mordechai so amazingly confident that Revach v'atzola yamod leYehudi mimokam acher, that there will be another source of salvation? Don't forget, Mordechai is living in the post-Holocaust generation after the Churban. Asher hagla Yerushalayim imagola asher hagla saw. He knew what Churban meant. He had seen the massacre, the exile, the destruction of the Churban Habayis. Maybe the Jewish people of Shushan and of that empire were doomed. And maybe there wouldn't be a Revach v'atzola yamad leYehudi mimokam acher. How was Mordechai so incredibly confident that he was actually also able to antagonize Haman v'lo kom v'lo zah? There was something that Mordechai knew. What was it that he knew? And this is a very fascinating question underlying the theme of Megillat Esther, and which is part of the Simcha V'Sosan of Purim itself. The Medrash Rabbah asks this question. The Medrash Rabbah says Eliyahu Hanavi came and told him that this decree would not, in fact, take place. There's another very beautiful Medrash in Medrash Rabbah of Esther, which says that Mordechai went to the Cheder and he asked the small children, tell me, what are the psukim that you are learning today? So one kid said to him a pasuk in Mishlei chapter 3, Al tira mi pachad pisaim umishayas rashayim ki tovei. The pasuk says, don't be afraid of the sudden terror of the Shoah, of the threatened destruction of the Rashayim. Don't be afraid. That was the pasuk that the kid innocently recounted to Haman, and he understood that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling him something. Don't forget, Mordechai has no nevuah. He doesn't have a direct connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But somehow Chazal say that after the Churban Habayis, nevuah came through the mouths of children. It came through innocent mouths who didn't know what they were saying, but we were listening to it, we can understand the message. And then he asked another child, what pasuk did you learn today? And he says, I learned a pasuk in Yeshaya chapter 8. Utzu eitzav v'sufa dabru dova v'lo yokum ki imonu keil. They will try and plan plans against you, v'tufar. They will be annulled, right? Like in Haforas Nedovim, Hashem Heifir Atzas Goyim. Those plans will be annulled. Ki imonu keil. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us, and all their plans will be foiled. That's the Medrash giving us an understanding that somehow Mordechai had some, wasn't prophetic knowledge, but some extraordinary knowledge that enabled him to be supremely confident. He knew that Klal Yisrael had to do tshuva, that Kenosos Kol Yehudim had to be united, they had to fast for 3 days. He knew that Esther had to do her job, but he knew that the result would be that Klal Yisrael would be saved. And in fact, all this is in the opening word of Megillat Esther chapter 4, Mordechai yoda es kol asher nasa. Mordechai had a yediyah, he knew something which other people didn't know. Other people just knew that this was a terrible potential threat. Lahashmid la'arga la'abez kol Yehudim. Right? Haman was the supreme, if you like, Nazi leader of that generation. And he had a final solution planned. And yet Mordechai had been told, Al tiro mi pachad pisei. And therefore he was able to say to Esther, you should know, I know. We're going to get out of this. The question is, will you play the role that you should play or not? And this is a very, very fascinating idea. But I'd like to take it one step further to connect Parshas Zohar to Megillas Esther at a deeper level. And this comes from the writings of Rav Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin. Very, very beautiful, profound ideas. Not that he needs my approbation, but he says something very fascinating here. He says that actually, I'll tell you what Mordechai knew. Mordechai knew something which Chazal knew and which the Rambam paskins in Halacha in the Mishnah Torah. Chazal tell us in Sanhedrin Daf Kaf, Sholosh mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael b'knisoson la'oretz. That there were 3 mitzvahs that Klal Yisrael had to do when they entered Eretz Yisrael. And what are those mitzvahs? The first one is limnos lahem melech, to appoint a leader, lahachriz zera Amalek, to do battle with Amalek, and livnos beis habechira, to build the Beis HaMikdash. And the pasuk there says, and the Gemara there says, it has to be in that order. The order is crucial. And indeed, if you look in the Rambam, Hilchos Melachim, chapter 1, halacha 1, he cites this Gemara verbatim. He says these 3 mitzvahs, the Malach, Mechias Amalek, and Beis HaBechira, have to be done in a particular sequence. Why that is, that's a longer story. Al Kol Ponim, Mordechai knew. What does it mean, Vayoda Mordechai, says Rav Tzadok HaKohen? That Mordechai knew that Yirmiyah HaNavi had said a nevuah, and that this nevuah was going to take place very shortly. And the nevuah was Shivas Tzion, that Klal Yisrael would go back to Eretz Yisrael and build the Bayis Sheni, build the second temple. He knew that that was going to happen. Right? He had that on firm account from Yirmiyah HaNavi, who was the dominant Navi of that period. And he said that imminently Klal Yisrael were going back to build the Bayis Sheni. Incidentally, I just want to mention, by the way, that to understand Megillas Esther properly, one has to learn Sefer Ezra. You have to learn the book of Ezra, because Megillas Esther belongs actually inside the book of Ezra. If you haven't read the book of Ezra, you don't know the context of Megillas Esther at all. Particularly, you can read the first 4 chapters of of Sefer Ezra, and you'll find that Koresh, Cyrus the king, gave them permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael, and Zerubbabel takes a whole 42,000 people to go on Aliyah to Beis HaMikdash to rebuild the Bayis Sheni. And what happens? A group of hardcore anti-Semites say Lashon Hara about them, and everything stops, and everything is frozen, and they're stranded in Israel, and they don't know what's going to be. They haven't got any more royal permission to build the Beis HaMikdash. What's going to be? That's the end of chapter 4 of Ezra. Suddenly, chapter 5 of Ezra, they decide, that's it, we can now build the Beis HaMikdash, everything is fine, and they get on with Shivas Tzion, and eventually, shortly, Ezra himself arrives. And the question is, what happened between chapter 4 and chapter 5? We don't know. How did that problem suddenly get resolved? And why is it that Ezra himself doesn't join them in the first Aliyah? He only comes later on, in chapter 6. So there's something very fascinating going on in the book of Ezra, and the answer is that there's a missing piece of the jigsaw. Between chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Ezra, there's a missing piece of the jigsaw, and that piece is Megillas Esther. What happens in the interim 18 years, there's an 18-year sort of black hole in the middle of the book of Ezra. In those 18 years, what happens is the whole Mordechai and Esther story. So by the time you get to the end of Megillas Esther, what happens is that the anti-Semites who had opposed the Binyan Bayis Sheni, according to Rashi on Megillas Esther, they were the Bnei Haman who were hung, the 10 Bnei Haman that we mentioned in Megillas Esther. They were the people who had stopped Binyan Beis HaMikdash. And now they could go ahead. All this Mordechai understood. Mordechai Yoda as Kol Asher Nasa. He understood the context in which all these events were taking place. And he knew that in order to build Bayis Sheni, we need to have a Melech, and we need to have Mechias Amalek. And how are we going to achieve that? Right? So he understood this idea, says Rav Tzadok HaKohen, and therefore he understood that he himself, what happens actually in the Megillat Esther is that several times it's emphasized that Esther and Mordechai, both of them, it says Vatilbash Esther Malchus, and with Mordechai it also says Mordechai Yotzah Milifnei HaMelech Belavush Malchus Techeles V'chua. Why is there such an emphasis on the clothes that Mordechai wore, that he wore royal type clothes? Why is that so important? Because that was the Malchus, that was a type of leadership which Klal Yisrael needed in order to set the ball rolling, in order to start the process. First Malchus, and then Mechias Amalek, that actually Haman represented physically and ideologically the power of Amalek to destroy Klal Yisrael, and Mordechai was engaging in that mitzvah. He was engaging in the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. That's why Parshas Zachor is so important before Megillas Esther, because only after Mechias Amalek and Megillas Esther can they go ahead and build the Bayis Sheni. And that's the great simcha that happens at the end of the Megillah, that suddenly there's an awareness that that's behind us now. Mordechai and Esther are both dressed in Big Day Malchus. They are the new leaders of Klal Yisrael at that point. They have orchestrated Mechias Amalek, and therefore, but that was really the great confidence of Mordechai. It's true that he'd heard Utzu Eitzer V'Sufa, he'd heard this mini nevuah out of the mouths of babes, but what he needed to understand was the process. The process was, we are on the way to build the Bayis Sheni, and the whole of Megillas Esther is really laying the foundations for building the Bayis Sheni, and therefore, as a result of the success of destroying Haman and his followers, the pasuk says, "Lehudim Oisa'ora v'Simcha v'Sasa and Vikar Kenti Alanu Be'ez Hashem." Indeed, the Mechias Amalek should take place in every generation to lay the foundations and the pathway towards the Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Amen.